Hi, friend. Welcome to Wild and Waking, a sacred space for the woman unraveling what no longer fits, remembering the truth that's always lived inside her, reclaiming her joy, her voice, her power, and rising fully, fiercely, and without apology. I'm your host, Emily Rushell, and together we'll explore what it means to live in alignment, lead with soul, and awaken a life of abundance, authenticity, and purpose. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome back to Wild and Waking. This is the first episode I have actually recorded in quite a while. I know that you have been getting weekly episodes for the past couple of weeks, months, but it is January 10th in real time as I'm recording. I am 38 weeks pregnant with my fourth baby. And getting ahead of the holiday deadlines, I batch recorded a ton of interviews and episodes back in November. So to actually be sitting down at the mic here in the new year feels very exciting, very fun. And hopefully by the time you listen to this, our sweet baby girl will have made her way into the world. But at time of release, I will still be 2 days away from my due date. So we shall see. Hello and welcome back. I am so delighted that we are here together. It is truly an honor to spend time every week or as often as you can with these conversations in your earbuds. I never take it for granted. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the way that you share these conversations with the people in your circle. Thank you for the messages that you send while and after you are listening in all of the ways that they impact and affect you. It means so much to me, especially solo episodes, because solo episodes can kind of sometimes feel like speaking into the void. But I'm very pumped today. We are going to kick off a 4-part solo episode series, diving into the different phases of the Wild and Waking framework. Now, the Wild and Waking framework is something that I formally put together in the summer-ish of 2025. For context, I have never been the kind of coach that super identified or felt like I needed to, or could even like put my finger on any kind of steps, framework type situation. Every element of coaching and facilitation and speaking and hosting that I do, I can look back in retrospect and know has been so intuitively led and channeled and dialed into, what the moment, what the person, what the group, what the organization needs at that moment in time. But after, starting with working with a business coach last year, we identified the need to bring some tangible language to the work that I was doing, especially as it has transformed so much in the past couple of years, and trying to really bring a conceptual understanding to something that feels undefined and intangible now more than ever. And so that is where this Wild and Waking framework was born. It is not a rigid roadmap or a one-size-fits-all kind of formula or like a 10-step plan to get from point A to point B. It is very much a living, breathing spiral. It is a rhythm that you and I move through again and again and again in our own unique ways as we navigate this Wild and Waking journey. It is not linear. It is not about finishing one phase and checking that box before going on to the next. It is really the ability to turn in and recognize where we are at right now and honoring that place as sacred and exactly where we are meant to be. And interestingly enough, I think I can identify in so many ways how I have gone through this journey, this framework, this cycle in like a big arc over the past couple of years, and also how this has shown up over the course of a month or a week or even a day, right? We are, especially as women, cyclical beings who are constantly moving through evolutions, especially when we're in a really big identity transformation or personal evolution. So sometimes you might feel like you are unraveling and rising all at once. And other times you will revisit something that you thought you had already moved through. It shows up again. That's not failure. The number of times I have personally said that or heard that on a coaching call of like, didn't we already deal with this? Haven't I already been here? Like, that's the point. That's how the cycle of growth actually moves. So each of the 4 phases of this framework, of this journey, the unraveling, the remembering, the reclamation, and the rise, serves as a window or a portal into a deeper truth, into a increased depth of self-trust, into further embodiment, and into the aligned action that we crave. These phases meet you wherever you are, whoever you are. Like I said, they're not rigid steps to follow. They're invitations to continuously go deeper and come home to yourself. And I'm going to break down specifically each of these phases in each episode over the next 4 solo episodes and kind of explain the context of what this journey has looked like for me in really big ways and in really small ways, what it continues to look like, the way I see it show up for the women I work with, the women who are in the coven, the women that I'm messaging with online, what kind of questions you might be asking. But just to give a little bit of context and overview, the unraveling is like when something starts to feel off and you can't quite name it and you start asking a ton of questions and it feels like you are taking everything apart, pulling out threads, making like a giant pile of yarn. It can feel so disorienting and confusing. The remembering is when those whispers of intuition return. It is when we start remembering who we are in the absence of all of these conditions and expectations and rules and obligations and systems that we have been fed and been a part of start to come back to us. And then the reclamation is when we really start putting it all back together and choosing differently and start embodying new iterations of our identity and self. And then the rise is when this embodied truth ripples into our leadership, our work, our vision, our purpose, our relationships, our legacy, and beyond. So this framework has really become the through line, the golden thread, the heartbeat of everything that I have been creating, from the coven to the retreats that I'm working on for this year, for new coaching containers, for community spaces, for this podcast, for the conversations that I'm bringing on to other people's podcasts. It is really a system, a cycle, an ecosystem, a scaffolding that holds you and I as we do the work to peel back these layers, reconnect with our truth, and rise into the embodied women that we came here to be. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Let me click to the other page of my notes because you know that if I just go off script, I will start rambling, and there are specific things that I did want to be sure to mention, especially since this is a series, right? You and I both know how easy it is for me to just get on here and yap away. But I do want to give you some concrete information and understanding. And I think these episodes are going to be really helpful if you have never worked with me, or if you've been curious about working with me, or you see things that are coming up in the future, if you're relatively new to this community in my world, to give you some context of really what we're doing here together, because it has evolved so much over the years. So let's start with the unraveling. Okay. When I think of this phase of the framework, of the journey, of the cycle, this is like the fire energy. This is burning away what no longer fits. This is uncomfortable. This gets raw. This gets honest. This is not the place where we're like necessarily trying to fix or problem solve. This is just starting to bring curiosity, awareness, and language to what is true, what has always been below the surface. This is where we start dismantling the roles, the stories, the systems, the conditioning that once felt safe and familiar and known, but are ultimately keeping you small, stuck, quiet, complacent, a cog in a machine, so to speak, And this can really feel like the most jarring, unsettling piece of this journey. And this is where a lot of women are coming to work with me right now. They are trying to put their finger on what they're experiencing. They're holding so much grief and disillusionment and like rage that's starting to uncover. This is where we feel exhausted in uncovering and exploring these pieces of our identity that no longer feel like they belong. And when I think back to this, it's so interesting that I'm recording this podcast today because yesterday I had 3 different calls with 3 different people that I've gotten connected to over the last several months with different intentions. Like one is a guest who's been on the podcast recently, and she kind of had this idea for this new program she's putting together specifically for expecting moms who are business owners. And so we'd kind of been talking about my experience with this pregnancy, and we'd been kind of going back and forth in DMs. I'm like, let's just get on a call and you can ask me whatever questions you want, right? Because I would kind of fit the avatar for who she would want to bring into this kind of program or container. The second call was with someone I got connected to through a mutual friend who is doing this really cool work at the intersection of like our political and social landscape and astrology, among many other things. We ended up talking for like 3 hours. It was so freaking fun. And then the third call was actually supposed to be a podcast interview for someone else's podcast that I'm currently in a mastermind with. And we both got on the call and we're just kind of like not feeling podcast interview vibes, right? Like, especially in the context of what has gone on over the past week, which is actually, I think, going to really be able to speak into this unraveling piece. But, you know, in the ICE murder of Renee Nicole Good, she and I were just feeling this like collective weight, you know, as moms, as business owners, as people, as humans. And neither of us just like had the energy or capacity to like put on our like podcast interview voice, right? And we ended up talking for multiple hours. Like literally, we just never hit record on the podcast and ended up just chatting, getting to know each other on a deeper level. And it was so interesting because in each of these totally unrelated conversations, they were all kind of rooted in each of us telling our stories to each other and kind of explaining the context of who we are and the work that we do and this journey that we've been on. And repeating that in like 3 different ways in one day as I'm preparing to give the context for this Wild Awakening framework and journey was like such a cool point of reflection. So if you've been here for a while, you have seen this transformation, but maybe this is the first episode you've ever heard of before. So for context, I'm an elementary school teacher by trade, spent 4 years as a 4th grade teacher, spent then 4 years in the nonprofit space. And during my time there, went through a really transformational health and personal growth journey that brought me to the world of personal growth and development. Kind of after this moment of, wow, I've checked all of the boxes and done all of the things that I was supposed to do to be successful. Why am I so miserable? What's wrong with me? Meanwhile, was navigating like some just really massive burnout at work, of which I could not name at the time, but know a lot more about at this point, and started sharing online with the intention of finding other women in small towns, rural communities connected to agriculture who were thinking and talking about the same things that I was, or who were interested in living life with intention, you know, building strong habits, going after big goals and dreams while still, you know, living in places where there are more cows than people. And so that's really the context in which my platform grew. And then ultimately, when I jumped into the world of entrepreneurship, that's the kind of work that I had intention of starting and ultimately kind of where my runway began in this realm of personal growth, habits, goals, etc. Fast forward a year as I'm coaching, facilitating masterminds, hosting treats, launching the podcast. leading this like online habit challenge community, I again hit burnout. And I'm like, whoa, Nelly, this is now the third time that I'm burning out in a career, and I don't like that. And that is what got me in therapy for the first time, confronting head on this really addiction that I had to approval, achievement, and accolades as a means of earning love and self-worth, which just started kind of this like whole untangling, talking more about mental health, which opened up the door to deeper healing, starting to understand the body, starting to understand, just different modalities, ideas, etc. But I can identify in 2023 or so, starting to have this feeling of like looking around and seeing these massive inconsistencies and injustices that were in my face at an ever present or ever growing rate, especially in small towns, in rural communities, in the circles that I was kind of in, and feeling this dissonance around like how I was showing up and like what I was being called forward to do, but I could not figure out what my place in it was. I was like, I don't feel like it is my job to make my entire platform in allyship to the LGBTQ community, for example. But that's like a piece of it, right? Or like, how do I have conversations around this or that or the other? And meanwhile, I'm years deep into coaching women who are smart and passionate and like so filled with purpose and dreams that will make the world a better place. And they are riddled with things like lack of confidence, decimated self-worth, imposter syndrome, drowning in other people's opinions and expectations. And so it just kept getting increasingly more clear of like, how did we get here in the first place, right? Meanwhile, I'm also starting to unpack my human design. I'm starting to understand kind of like what my gifts are that I'm bringing to the table and just trying to like make sense of freaking everything. And this begins my unraveling in a really big way, where I start asking questions about everything. And it starts with like one thread here or there, and it just continues to unravel. And one thing leads to another. And all of a sudden, I'm, doing deconditioning work and starting to deconstruct and trying to understand the context in which different people come into the worldviews, opinions, and perspectives that they do, right? And then I'm starting to, pull threads at religion and politics and hustle culture and the body and feminine cycles and, race relations and just fucking everything. Okay. This is what the unraveling looks like. It is like starting to get that nudge of something isn't right. Okay. And I think that this looks a little bit different for everyone. Maybe for you, it's not like everything at once. And I use the word at once with dramatics now looking back. I'm saying this was like a 2023 to like an early 2025 situation. If you want to go back and really look at what this looked like in real time, you can scroll through the episode titles of the podcast and you can see almost in real time what I was exploring, or even there is some lag behind like when I was ready to have the conversations I was having. But you can watch that expansion. You can watch that deepening. You can watch that exploration. You can watch that willingness to step into the unknown and not speak to anything purposefully or perfectly, but to get really curious, right? About who I am, who you are, how we all fit in the context of this world together, and ultimately like how we've gotten to where we are today. And it's all interconnected. And this is where so many women that I work with, especially looking at the coven, are at, is like, they're like, something isn't right. I feel crazy. I feel like no one else I know is asking these questions, which is funny because when I started my original Instagram account, I did it as a woman in a small town in a rural community who felt really isolated and alone. Like I've been using the phrase, you feel like you're the only person in your zip code that understands, right? And at the time, I was talking about ambition and dreams and goals and habits and half marathons and gentle parenting and yada, yada, yada. And now, fast forward almost 6 years later, it's these women who are doing deep, introspective, identity shaking work, who are asking deeper questions on the way that they were raised, the systems and structures that they've been a part of, these expectations and ideologies that they've been held accountable to. Everything from body standards to achievement to motherhood to the way that they're showing up at work to the roles that they've played in the church to, political influence from family and community of origin, and starting to see these inconsistencies that are rubbing up against this truth that's trying to emerge. And this looks different for everyone. Just because I listed off like 20 different areas, I see this unraveling happen specifically with women in so many pockets of our society right now, asking deeper questions around education, around healthcare, around food systems, around agriculture, around the way that we parent, right? Everyone who is paying attention and has 1 ounce of conscious awareness is doing this in some capacity. And then it becomes this evolutionary trajectory if you're willing to say yes, right? I would not be doing the work and having the conversations I am today if I hadn't allowed myself in 2019 to start reframing what it looked like to take care of myself and to start taking care of my body from a place of love instead of shame and moving and fueling myself in ways that felt good instead of what someone else told me was going to make me skinny or aesthetically pleasing in a certain way. Right? Like when I even think back to UDU82, which is the habit challenge I created back in, what was that, 2020 or so? It was all about being able to tune in and listen to like, what do you actually need in this season? Let go of everyone else's rules. What do you need right now? What were you able to do 2 years ago? Like, what do you actually need right now? And let's do that through the lens of progress over perfection. And it's so cool to me how that exact concept is what has been drawn forward into this wild and waking journey that we are on today. It's the willingness to tune into yourself of what do I need? What questions are coming forward? What curiosities am I meant to explore? What masks am I taking off? Right? When I think about this unraveling part of my journey, I felt like I had created these boxes for myself. Right? I had built this beautiful business and community and online presence in this niche of ag, rural, small town women, and suddenly was feeling in juxtaposition to what the perceived norm of expectations. I say perceived because this was all very much in my perceived reality. And it's like I couldn't get off a wet, heavy sweater fast enough because suddenly I was like, I am rejecting this. I do not feel like I belong here. I do not feel like I'm safe here. There were several instances where I was at like conference or in rooms or in conversations where I was like, I have the ick so hard and I don't even know why. But like I want to throw up or run away, and I don't feel like I belong here anymore. I think that I am fundamentally different, and it is not okay. And because it is not okay, my core wound is fear of rejection and abandonment. And so I felt so unsafe in myself and my body because I could feel the distance growing between this version of myself that I had been showing up as and what was bubbling underneath the surface and the questions that I was asking and the things that I was thinking about and the values that were coming forward and the discrepancies I was starting to see and the truths that were emerging. And I felt so uncomfortable. I wanted to just run away. And I know that as you listen to this, you have had a moment like that too. Maybe it's with your parents. Maybe it's with the moms as you walk into the gym for your kids' basketball game. Maybe it is at your church Bible study. Maybe it is something you see driving down the road, something you heard on a podcast, something that you saw online where suddenly you were like, that doesn't feel right. But it used to not feel wrong. What is wrong with me? Right? And all of this is happening for me as so much is rapidly changing and growing and bubbling and escalating in our cultural, social, political landscape. When we look at 2023 or so to 2025, right? And I think for many of us, the masks, the disillusionment, the going through the motions was born in 2020. It was like this reckoning of like everything we knew to be true was suddenly pulled away in an instant, right? And so we've seen this trajectory over the past several years of continuing to challenge and ask questions and continuing to try to figure out how we fit into the context of this world that we're participating in capitalism, in government, in all of these system structures and cycles that we're a part of. And so this unraveling is messy because this is when it starts to crumble, and not always in really big ways, but in small ways. And that little voice in the back of your head that says, this doesn't feel right. Right? I can think of a couple specific instances where I was sitting in church and listening to a sermon being like, that does not resonate on such a level that I feel viscerally uncomfortable. Or seeing people that I know posting things and sharing things and being like, no, I can't participate in that anymore. And I used to. It's like these cracks start forming. And I've talked about this on the podcast at length, but it's in my human design. But I have always identified as the type of person who can see things from multiple angles at once. I can hold multiple truths at once. And it used to make me feel flaky and flighty and like I couldn't make up my mind. But like I could see where most people were coming from on pretty much everything, right? But it was like within my core, I started to ask deeper questions to understand where those truths were coming from in the first place, and starting to land more firmly on like, what is my truth? Like I can have compassion, I can have understanding, I can have intellect for like where other perspectives are curated, and also they're not my truth to hold. Totally lost my train of thought. My daughter came in here. They had art class this morning, which was very fun. But let's see, where was I? Where was my train of thought? I was on fire, y'all. And normally when I'm on fire and I get interrupted, I can jump back in, but I don't know where I was. So we just may have to leave that impassioned rant and come back to it. Anyway, the unraveling is where, in whatever capacity, where everything starts falling apart. And it is fucking terrifying. And I am telling you right now, most people will not allow themselves to ever go through this experience because it is rattling. Because once you start, it's really hard to stop. And most people don't know how to put it all back together, right? I was talking to my friend yesterday, and she has a life experience where ultimately leaving her marriage, a very, very toxic situation, prompted her to walk away from the Mormon church, and really went through her unraveling in this process. And she was like, you know, Emily, the craziest part is it wasn't just the church or the religion. It was trying to figure out and psychologically make sense of every single piece of who I was, because there was no part of my identity or my belief system or my understanding of the world that wasn't propped up in some capacity by my upbringing in that situation. And so we were just talking about what that process really looks like, because it requires sifting through so many truths, so many ideas, so many ideologies, so many legs in which our entire sense of self stands. She was like, it was in the way that I parented. It was in the way that I understood other people. It was in the way that I coped with my stress, in the way that I understood life and death, in the way that I understood morality, in the way that I understood my role in my family, in the way that I understood my sense of self. She was like, it was everything, everything. And so to go through this process of navigation, to try to sort through what makes sense, what resonates, what's mine, what was handed to me, what do I no longer resonate with, is brutal. And most people will never allow themselves to do it because it's terrifying. It can be so dark and confusing and rattling and unsettling, right? And so this is where being able to step into a situation, into a community, into a place, into a podcast, in relationships with people who are navigating this unraveling. And I need you to understand, this doesn't mean throw everything you've ever known out the window. This is a conversation that has come up so many times in the coven for these women who are going through unraveling in whatever aspect of their life that they are. It's like, it doesn't mean you're just chucking it all out and copying and pasting and finding something new to replace it with. It's like sorting through a messy closet and being like, what do I need? What do I not? What can I donate? What do I want to hang on to? What means something to me? What still resonates? What's true? And putting it all back together, except for that's not the unraveling phase, right? But it's that like walking into like a hoarder level basement and trying to figure out what you need and what you like and what is no longer serving you, right? This is where we start understanding our survival patterns, like I said, the things that they're handed to us. Some questions that might feel really helpful if you identify with this phase right now is, what stories or systems you know is no longer yours to carry? Where are you performing palatability at the expense of your truth? What roles, identities, or obligations feel like costumes you have outgrown? What rage or grief or exhaustion has been dismissed? Where have you been told you're too much? And what happens when you finally honor the way that you're feeling? Where do you feel split between who you are, who you're becoming, and who you think you are supposed to be? What beliefs or narratives have you been too afraid to question out loud for fear of whatever? Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of isolation, fear of going to hell, fear of being a bad person, fear of going against the grain? Just even asking the question can be very unsettling. What are you tolerating that your body is starting to scream no? When you walk into a physical space, when your phone lights up from a certain person, from a certain conversation, from a certain channel, from a media outlet, where are you starting to feel that immediate sense of no and dread, but continuing to show up out of tradition, out of ritual, out of obligation, out of expectation, out of habit? And where have you been telling yourself that you're fine? And what would it look like if you stopped? Right? This is the release. This is the life, the identity, the something that I have built doesn't feel like mine anymore. This was like the wet, heavy sweater I could not get off fast enough. Okay? This is the spark that begins your transformation, dismantling the roles, the stories, the systems that once kept you safe, but now keep you small. Okay? It feels intense, but I promise it is making space for new life to grow. It is the moment that you stop pretending that fine is good enough. The moment that you admit that what once felt like safety and familiarity now feels like suffocation. It is an exhale of honesty, a reckoning with all the ways you have shaped yourself to be liked, to be accepted, to be successful, and the inner knowing that those no longer fit. This phase is not about fixing anything. It is about starting to name what is true or not true. It is about acknowledging your rage, your grief, your disillusionment, and the fatigue that you have been carrying. Not as problems to solve. We're not going into fix-it mode, but as messengers to start pointing you towards your liberation and freedom. Here, we are practicing radical honesty. We are looking at the stories and the systems and the expectations and the conditioning that shaped us and starting to ask if they still deserve space in our lives. We notice the places we're starting to split ourselves in two or more to maintain appearances or the status quo. We start to name the rules we never consciously agreed to. And we begin to wonder, with curiosity, not judgment, what might be possible if we stopped performing and started telling the truth. This is the unraveling. This is really hard. This is really hard, and it's really important. And I think we are collectively seeing this on a grander scale than we have ever have, at least in my lifetime. And I think it's incredibly timely to be having this specific conversation this week in what is going on in the world, specifically speaking from the perspective of a middle-class white girl. I went through most of my life of having the privilege of not having to think that hard about the systems and structures that were mostly working in my favor, right? And now we're being confronted with the realization that that is not true for most people and what role we have played in it, and also the million ways it is also keeping us stuck and miserable, especially as women. So anyway, we will continue this series. I know leaving here feels a little bit brutal because the unraveling is brutal. I want to keep going, but then this will turn into a 4-hour episode. But the next time we tune in, we are going to talk about the remembering. This is when we really start to soften and turn inward and start to remember who the fuck we are in the absence of all this bullshit. Then we will move into the reclamation phase as we really start putting it all back together, reshaping that identity in a way that feels so freaking good. And then last, as we rise into our leadership and our life and our legacy and our community and our impact and beyond, I promise it is not all feel as heavy as the unraveling does, but the unraveling is heavy. And remember, there may be specific periods of time that you can identify as your unraveling in the same way that I could kind of identify that period of time. And also during that unraveling, I was also simultaneously remembering and reclaiming and rising, right? I'll be able to identify this arc and the way this played out in a really big way, and also what this might have looked like on a day-to-day basis. So we will continue having this conversation. If you identify with the things that we have shared in this episode, please shoot me a message. This is literally the space for you to unravel safely. You deserve to be held in the hard questions that you're asking, in the hard conversations you're stepping into, in the curiosities that you are exploring. It is not easy work, but that is what we are doing here. And so I want to be a person that holds you through this messy, messy phase. So until next time, thank you so much for tuning in to Wild and Waking. I am really, truly so deeply and profoundly grateful for each and every one of you. And I'll see you back. Hey friend, I hope this conversation sparked something real in you. Something that feels like truth, curiosity, or the courage to keep becoming. If this episode resonated, I'd love for you to share it. Take a screenshot, post it to your stories, or send it to one of your friends. You can always find me over on Instagram at Emily Rushel, where I love continuing these conversations and hearing your takeaways. Truly, your DMs are one of my favorite parts of podcasting, so don't be shy. I'd love to reflect and connect with you over there. I'm so grateful to be surrounded by a community of women who ask hard questions, sit in the discomfort of the unknown, blaze new paths forward, and ultimately come home to their wild and waking selves. See you next week.